we knew the results, so especially pleased with that. My name is Brenda Russell. I'm the president of the UIC chapter of SUAA, State University Annuitants Association. And anyone who is employed at UIC on a SURS pension plan, in other words, every month you work, you get a deducted amount to go towards your pension. We're the organization that watches out that those pensions are here when you need them and protect the benefits while you're working and afterwards. Particularly important is health insurance, both for current employees and retirees. So that's my pitch. If you're not a member, come see me, we will sign you up. And it's not just faculty. Some people think it's faculty. It's not. It's every employee. So, Marcia, do you know if we're going to get any more chairs?
Well, they're trying to get some now.
They're trying to get some. I think we'll just go ahead and begin, and hopefully some chairs will come in. It's my pleasure to introduce Dick Simpson. I sort of feel like saying he needs no introduction to the UIC group. Been on the faculty here for over 30 years. Department head. I always forget the name of your department.
Political science.
Political science. Political science, duh. I do want to point out that Dick has written a new book, and there are copies at the back. And if you purchase one, and he's willing to sign them. So I think that's another opportunity to hear him in person ask questions. He was an alderman in Chicago before becoming a faculty member. And he's watched local, state, and federal politics in an academic but highly informed way for many years. So it's a real pleasure to introduce you, Dick.
Gee, this is better than the city council. They didn't give me a microphone there, so that's an extra pleasure. I think most of you know the bottom line of the election was the Trump triumph. That's unfortunate for many people, but that is the circumstance. The new book is called Winning Elections in the 21st Century, and it's how to apply some of the national techniques, even in the most local of elections. And we use as a case study a state legislative election of Will Guzzardi here in the Chicago region to illustrate how it all comes together. Donald Trump won the Electoral College, even though he didn't win the popular vote. And he is going to become the President of the United States, and as you know, that will affect things quite substantially. If he's able to carry out his platform promises, he will create major changes, of course, in tax policy, but also in immigration policy, which is particularly important to many of us here at UIC, in foreign policy, and by his Supreme Court appointments, he will also affect social policies like abortion and gay rights, just to mention some of the most important effects of this election. Of course, the election occurred with more than the presidency, and I will be talking about what the effects are here locally, and for this group particularly, what the effects on funding the university and the pension plans will be. There will be in time a broad resistance to those policies, as you've already seen in the demonstrations. But I must tell you that in the so-called first 100 days, by executive order and by his ability to use the momentum to pass laws in Congress, Mr. Trump will get many of his policies in place. So he will at the beginning change the direction of the country. If those of you who remember the Reagan economics at other times will talk about how eventually policies can be reversed, even if there is a successful beginning to a presidency. But to put this in perspective, it's worth remembering that Barack Obama won the 2012 election, and with that election, he had both the popular and electoral college vote. The Democrats gained seats in the Senate and controlled the Senate in those hardy sort of high salon days by 55 to 45. But the House of Representatives has remained in the hands of the Republicans, and the 2014 election changed things drastically because the Republicans gained control of both the House and the Senate, and that set up the gridlock which we've known the last few years in Washington, D.C. Now, after this election, the Republicans will have a narrower margin in the Senate, probably 52 to 48. There is a sort of runoff election going on in Louisiana, so we don't know, it might even be closer. Nonetheless, at the moment, Trump proposals to be blocked, with, like, say, for instance, destroying Obamacare, would require some moderate Republicans to join with Democrats, and they probably won't do that very often in this first period. That may change. In the House, before this election, the Republicans had a 248 to 188 majority. The Democrats have probably gained up to 195 seats, which could be as many as a 9-seat change, but they didn't gain the 30 seats they needed to get the Congress. Nonetheless, part of, and we can come back in the questions and I can explain the actual mechanics of what is at stake, particularly in the House of Representatives. They may not be entirely in lockstep with the President. As you know, Mr. Ryan and Mr. Trump have had a sort of rocky relationship for some time. I don't want to suggest too much comfort in that, but I want to suggest that it's not as simple as Trump simply announcing a policy in the campaign and it automatically getting carried out. They're both the Congress and some resistance as constituents put pressure on. The easiest one to see at the moment is the debate over the Obamacare, where people are saying, wait, I really want to keep having health care without pre-existing conditions. I really don't want caps so that if I get cancer, health care won't pay for treating the disease entirely. I do really want to keep students like some of the ones in this room on my policy at least until they're 26 years old and so forth. So as constituents begin to put pressure about specific matters onto the agenda, pressuring their congressmen, some of the congressmen may decide that it's better to make an arrangement with the more moderate Democrats, and that will allow a sufficient force to block particular items. Like I say, that doesn't change the general direction, but it does mean that it is possible to resist particular proposals that President Trump and his administration may have. Now, before I go into that discussion further, let me tell you a few more things about the election. First of all, as you can say after every election, I could just can this and repeat it after the next election. It was the most expensive election in American history. Every election we've held, at least the elections of the same kind, the midterm elections don't have the presidency running and don't spend quite as much money usually, but other than those kinds of variations, in general, every election is the most expensive election. How expensive? Well, they spent at least, we're still counting, or other people are counting and the rest of us are watching, they spent at least $1.3 billion in the presidential election. In the race for the House, which may surprise you, by the way, there's seats coming in, so everyone's going to get a chair in just 1 second. They spent $1 billion on the elections to the House of Representatives. The Senate, which had only a few seats up, only a third of the Senate, spent a total of $700 million on the election. And I want to get to the more local races and what the effects of that are as well. To break it down, candidates in congressional elections spent at least $2 million, and many spent much more depending on the political action committee money that was poured into truly contested districts. Most of that money in Illinois was spent in races that were contested, like the suburban elections. On the other hand, what was really surprising locally this time, and has never been this way before, is that in the contested state legislative races, state legislative candidates were spending $2 million each on both sides in the contested state legislative district. For those of you that live in Chicago, to put it in perspective, the state legislative district is approximately the size of 2 wards. It is not a congressional district. It's not the state of Illinois. And what does this translate to? The most expensive state legislative race, the cost per vote that the candidates received ranged from the losing candidate spending $106 per vote received, and the winning candidate spending $133 per vote received. Both got about 25,000 votes, a lot of money, both well over the $2 million per candidate in a state legislative race. So very briefly, we just have to get some control over this. If you look at the people at the table next to you, suppose you decided you wanted to run for state legislature, could you raise from your table $2 million? Well, unless the retirees and the students have gotten a lot more wealthy than I know about, passing the hat at your table is not likely to be successful. And that means a number of things about the nature of the candidates. In addition, much of the money, particularly that came in PAC funding, political action committees, was dark money. And in Illinois, we know the 3 people who funded the Republican side because they just wanted to, they were happy to let it be known. But in general, much of the money that poured into these races was secret money. We don't know which oil company or which wealthy investor or which market fund or stock trader gave money to whom, for what purpose, later down to fix the tax laws or to fix regulations or to do other things that would benefit them privately. The bottom line of all of that is we desperately need to do public funding of campaigns. Not just new laws about disclosure restrictions and so on, but genuine public funding. Places like Minnesota, New York City have such laws. It works very simply. Barry Runquist just came in. If I wanted to give Barry Runquist money for his campaign, and I gave him $250 because I'm a poor college professor, but I wanted to help him out, that would be matched 6 times. So he would actually get a lot of money for his campaign from a small donation. If he had a lot of small donations, he would have enough to run a credible campaign, because it isn't always the most money that wins the election. You've just got to get enough money to be able to get your message to the voters. Then it depends on the candidate, the issues, and lots of other things as to who gets elected. I see a number of women in the room interested in this election for obvious reasons. But one of the things that doesn't get looked at as often is how many women are in public office. Yes, a woman didn't get elected president this time, but it was a major step forward in having a woman as a candidate of a major party. However, if we look, I don't have the latest figures because we're still trying to figure out exactly who got elected where, but I'll give them to you just before this election. Before this election, after 2014, there were 20 women in the U.S. Senate. Now, you don't have to have too many fingers and toes to add up that there are 100 people in the U.S. Senate, and 20 is not 51%. In the House of Representatives, the score isn't any better. It's 84 in the House, and so on down the line. So while this was a breakthrough year for women in some senses, the actual balance of how many women are there did not change significantly. Likewise, while blacks are fairly well represented because they've been fighting for it for a long time, Latinos and Asian Americans are not. They're in very small proportions in comparison to their population in any of the governing bodies of the country. So if we want the government to look more or less like the people, we have to make changes, and that's one of the reasons we have our book to tell you how to, if you are a woman or a Latino or Asian American or anyone else, how to successfully run those campaigns. In the Illinois, we of course went counter to the national trends. We were a significant blue state, although if you look at the maps, which I have, the number of counties actually carried for Hillary Clinton was lower than the number of counties carried for Barack Obama. So while we did buck the trend, we didn't entirely in the popular vote in Illinois. But it was sufficient not just to elect Hillary Clinton. The Illinois Congressional Delegation before this election was 10 Democrats and 8 Republicans. It's now 11 Democrats and 7 Republicans. I won't go through everyone, but Brad Snyder was one of the new victories up in the 10th Congressional District. So we have a pretty strong Democratic delegation, and what makes it more impressive is we did have before 1 Democrat and 1 Republican as U.S. Senator. We now have 2 Democrats as U.S. Senator. So as I say, Illinois has a strong Democratic congressional delegation. One might ask exactly how much that helps us in a Trump Republican administration. You know, the ability to go say to the president, you know, geez, please give us another road or bridge funding is not as strong if you're a Democrat and the president is Republican. Okay, I want to cover now some of the situations in the state. And by now you may have read how that worked out. The Republicans made gains. They picked up 4 seats in the House of Representatives of the General Assembly. They picked up 2 seats in the Senate. The bottom line is there's only one difference. Before the election, Mike Madigan had a theoretical supermajority, which wasn't actual, and we can go into the details of why that was. Now it's quite clear he does not have a supermajority, and so they cannot, by the Democratic vote, overcome the governor's veto on their own. I talked to legislators before the election, and they were predicting that the Republicans would probably win a couple of seats. By the way, the majorities are still overwhelming. They're just not at the level to overcome the veto. And what they thought is, now that the Republicans have some responsibility for what's happening in the state, that the Republican legislators would be willing to compromise and come out with what you care about here at the university, a budget, that there would be some stability. Whether or not they could get an income tax back to the level before was less certain, but they could certainly have just a normal operating budget. And, you know, instead of 1/3 of the money we're owed, and sort of what we're getting at the moment for the last 6 months, we get 2/3 of the money we're owed, or something like that. That it would go up and it would be stable. We could actually count on whatever the number was, because it would be built into the money. So that is not a sure thing. And so all of you who are interested, both through SUAA action, SUAA action, and through Illinois Connect for students and faculty currently on campus, as well as alumni, we have a major lobbying task ahead of us. And if you want, I can go through a little more about what the situation in the state legislature is. But at least the prediction was that there was going to be no budget during the veto session, the one that's just ending in another week. There was hope that maybe in January there would be a session, but what it most depends, that would produce a budget. What it most depends on is switching some Republican votes. Otherwise, the grand compromise with Governor and Speaker Madigan and so forth would do it, but that doesn't seem to be any closer to happening than it was before the election, and the election didn't change that very much. Now, there are a few things I also wanted to touch on the election, and I'll be glad to take questions and listen to your comments about it all. There's some very interesting reform experiments that took place in 2014 and 2016. Voters can register or change their registration electronically online. For students, that has been really a big thing, but it's been important for many sectors of Illinois. Early voting has been extended longer than ever, and as you know, we had 3 days of early voting in this room at UIC. I'm going to cover specifically UIC numbers in just a moment. By court decision, voters are allowed to register in the precinct polling place on Election Day. And the one fly in the ointment about all of that, sort of making it more possible to have more people registered and more people voting, the one difficulty is the governor vetoed the automatic voter registration, which would be whenever you do anything with the state, like apply for a license to be a beautician, be a driver's license, any of those times you go to a state office or electronically give them information, you would, unless you ask them not to, you would be automatically registered to vote with the same information. You wouldn't have to make a special effort to register. The governor thought there might be fraud, that somehow it would be misused, and so he vetoed it. The Senate, the state Senate, overrode the veto easily, and the House vote originally was overwhelming. I can't remember, it's like 180 to 4 or something. It was a huge vote originally for the automatic voter registration. The real question is, will at least a couple of Republicans vote with the Democrats to have automatic voter registration? Or will everybody, which any way we would get it would be helpful. But let me tell you the good news about UIC. We have registered since the beginning of the March primary, last January. We have registered more than 2,000 students. We have confirmed the registration of another couple of thousand. And of course, there are a sizable number of international students and undocumented and others who can't register. What that has meant, and we had, as I say, early voting here, we had more than 1,000 students vote in this room in the 2 days of early voting. There was a regular amount of voting in the precinct on campus. In short, I can say definitively that this has been the biggest civic engagement activity in the history of the campus in the sense of registering and voting students. So we have been able to do that, and partly we're able to do that by the new laws and the new pressure with the Board of Elections to do things like open the early voting on campus. So what is next? For those that supported Donald Trump, the answer is pretty simple. If you supported President Trump, then you work with him to be successful in the first 100 days. Yes, things will happen later, but if you use the momentum of the first 100 days, not only in executive orders, but in getting laws passed in Congress, you have the most profound effect. So if you're a Trump supporter, that's what you do. Those that oppose President Trump and his policies need to build a long-term resistance. Much as we did when we formed the Illinois Coalition Against Reagan Economics, or ICARE, back in the 1980s. President Reagan came in, he had a bunch of policies. He was going to change the tax policy. More importantly, locally, he was going to take $440 million away in funding for Chicago and various federal grants and programs that had existed, and make other changes like that. He was taking away the VISTA workers so community organizations wouldn't have the extra staff, so on and so forth. A group of coalition of organizations came together, built ICARE. We did have protests of 5,000 people or more at a time, but more than that, we eventually convinced Congress to step up and block the worst of President Reagan's bad proposals. Obviously, a lot of things passed that were fine that Reagan wanted. And I also have some experiences leading the opposition in the Chicago City Council, which built the base for Harold Washington and his mayoralty, where he passed the things that were voted down when I was alderman. Now that's going to be possible. I mean, it's fine to have the demonstrations and to sign petitions and to use social media now, but that's going to have its real effect when actual citizens feel the impact of Trump policies. That's when the resistance will become high enough that it will affect members of Congress and block proposals that are proposed by President Trump. Here in Illinois, we must demand that the new legislature and the governor pass a reasonable budget with some increased taxes. Let me tell you how bad it is. I mean, you know what the situation is at the university. My prediction is we will have the collapse of 3 state universities by the end of August, that we will lose Chicago State and Eastern and Western. Others, like Northeastern, are very fragile. And if it were to continue for a long period of time, other universities might collapse. We have, as you know, the MAP funding, which supplies, I can't even remember now, I think half of our students get MAP grant, I think maybe 2/3. A large number of our students depend on that state funding this year as part of their scholarship package to be able to go to school here. So this, and you know that we've had no new hiring of faculty, we have larger classes. You see now the effects of that on the state, but it can be worse. I serve on the board of the Northside Housing and Social Services, which provides the homeless services on the north side of Chicago. We have had no choice but to close our shelter for the homeless at People's Church. We're throwing 77 men out on the street. I have no doubt that some will die this year because there are two reasons. One, we don't have any guaranteed state funding, just like the university. December 31st ends our funding. And unlike the university, we don't have an endowment that would allow us to ride it over. Secondly, even when the state did fund our shelter, we were spending $500,000 a year to run it, and they were paying us $400,000. Well, for a social service agency, you can do that for a while, but you can't do it forever. So it's important not only that we get a state budget, but that we get an adequate state budget for whichever causes or concerns you most care about. We need to do the kinds of pressuring that will convince the legislature to do that sooner than later, because just like we have had to close a shelter and throw people out on the street, that's going to become more and more frequent. It already has with mental health clinics. I could go on and on down the social service list of disasters, serious ones that have been called. Now, in the end, and with this I'll finish, this was an election in which the majority of Americans voted no against the elites and against the status quo. Why would they do that? Well, let me give you a few simple statistics that suggest why. 4.4 million foreclosures of homes since 2008. 4.4 million families no longer are homeowners. There hasn't been a raise for the working and middle class since 2008. Maybe they got a 1% or something sometime in between that didn't meet the cost of inflation. But basically, the middle class in Chicago is shrinking. In our urban studies, we have a map which shows the rich, the poor, and the middle class. And in Chicago, the middle class used to be pretty big. It is now shrunk, and it is smaller than either the rich or the relatively wealthy in Chicago. The middle class is disappearing, and that makes the people who were in the middle class obviously very unhappy and distraught that their lives are changed and they're now part of either the working class or the poor. Unemployment, while officially at 6%, is in fact at 40% in the ghettos. And as those who are in the room that are younger know, among those who are 20 and 30, it's also very high. At least over a third are unemployed or drastically underemployed. So it's a very simple election in that sense. Americans were saying, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. And they decided that the way to express that was to vote for President Trump. And while the Democrats made some gains in some other levels, they lost at the top, and they also, unfortunately, lost at many state legislatures across the country, which has to be changed in 2018 or 2020, or they will be the people who draw the maps for the next Congress,